So let's talk a little bit about how great founder theory turns into institutions, right? So you have a leader at the top that has a vision. They are able to bring together a group of people to start enacting that vision. But the way it turns into an institution is if they find a way to pass on both the explicit and the implicit knowledge. Like technically, how do you do this? But then what about all those things that you can't possibly write down? So describe this a little bit more in detail for people. What is the challenge to making a bureaucracy that endures?
Yeah, just a little bit of a correction. The great founder doesn't need to start at the top. Sometimes they even start at the middle or at the bottom of the old society. But otherwise, your description is correct. They inspire, organize, draw together people into a new mode of living, either very narrow, like a military process, or very wide, like a whole new religion. And then this causes a terraformation of society. But the succession problem you described, that one is very difficult. No one ever fully understands what is our origin, right? Sure. Human origins. Maybe you know what your family is. Maybe even when your religion was founded. Maybe you know things about your nationality, things about your childhood. But you're never going to recreate the set of experiences that went into making you. The essence either. So what you're doing is essentially picking and choosing what is the enduring and essential institution, a feature of this institution, right? What are the virtues you can't skip over? What are the skills you can't skip over? What are the mechanisms you can't skip over? And how do I make this very transmittable? My company is named after a statesman I greatly admire. My company is called Bismarck Analysis, but I'm going to actually critique Bismarck. One of the most important critiques of this 19th century statesman, he basically created what we would think of as the modern state, is that he created a foreign policy so brilliant and intricate that no one could possibly wield it except him. So part of the genius of good succession is creating something that is functional and simple enough to transmit. Even if you're capable of creating a greater artwork, a greater science, a greater company, pause to consider, will I be able to hand this on? And if I won't be able to hand it on, well, am I okay with this being an effect on society for one generation? Maybe I am. There are some institutions that should only last one generation. But if you're hoping for a deeper, wider reform, well, that's going to take a while. And again, I think the perspectives here often are quite explicit, right? Religion is always tricky to talk about, but if you look at the New Testament and Jesus's message, it's definitely intended to be something that slowly transforms all of society, even if only a small number of people ever became Christian. Or if you read Confucius, right, who's more a philosopher, his perspective is that there's a slow outward radiation of the right way of being, of the right way of living, starting with, say, filial piety and continuing with this, service to the common good in the state, and so on. And we could give other examples as well, such as, Plato's thoughts on how society might be reformed or improved. So this long-term perspective exists in people because I think people can't help but care about the biggest things. So if you care about the biggest things, why don't you try to, plant seeds, that grow into oaks? Still, let's talk now about the concretes of succession. I said you have to pick and choose what is worthy of transmission. I think that one of the strongest recommendations I have is the equivalent of a master-apprentice relationship in, say, medieval European guilds or in, say, martial arts contexts, because in that case, if you establish an imitation between student and teacher, this imitation goes beyond the explicit, right? The way you move a hand when you grab a tool. It's one of the reasons that these so-called tacit skills that are difficult to put into words still matter. Even if you're doing something like the practice of law, where you might think, oh, this is all explicit. No. The way you discuss problems with your colleagues, right? The way you ask your clients for information. These are things about verbal behavior that you just can't describe in words. It would be an explosion of words. You would need 100 words to describe what you're doing with 10 words and 10,000 words to describe what you're doing with with 100 words, and so on. It will be exponential. So some things have to be transmitted just through observation, imitation, and importantly, also correction. If those are internalized successfully and deeply, I think interesting things can happen. Important about the master-apprentice relationship isn't just imitation between, teacher and student and all of that. It isn't just the opportunity to closely observe someone at work. It is also the apprentice is exposed to similar constraints and problems as the teacher is. Right? They're doing the same type of business. Look, they're not just bringing you coffee, that they might start by bringing you coffee. You have to give them the same type of work that you do, menial or not, and let them succeed or fail at it. And if that happens, then, incentives, instead of being something you're trying to shield your successor from, become your allies in molding your successor. I could give some other historical examples of how this has worked. Like beyond that approach, there's also the question of where do you recruit from, right? Like the job that you leave someone might not be the same job you started off with. If you are recruiting for a successor for a company that started off as just you and your friends, but now is like 50,000 people or 5,000 people. Well, maybe, searching in the same corners of society that you search for your friends initially, maybe that won't work. Sometimes it might, but maybe it won't.
Yeah, I think about this
because you've been transformed through the process of running your company.
I think about this in the challenge of a lot of the industry groups that have come up, particularly in agriculture. So I work in this space. I go to talk to a lot of farm bureaus, a lot of co-ops, and the challenge that they have is the people that were there to build the original institution. The farming itself is different and the needs of that institution are different. And you can't just say like, oh, well, let's just hire from within, because you may not have the skills from within to be able to make the organization adaptable enough to change so that they can adapt to the new circumstances. But then also going outside brings in a new problem, because now you may actually be changing the core focus or vision of the group. Whoever you put in as the leader may not want to do the same thing that the organization was doing there before. So you kind of have that, what is it? It's not a Thucydides trap. It's the ship, right? Where you replace all of the...
Ship of Theseus.
Theseus, that's right. And like, how many parts can you replace in an organization and still have it be the same? And I think that modern society is really grappling with this problem, because society has changed around them so quickly that to figure out, do we need to have more apprentices? Do we need to go outside to find the next person? How do we propagate this organization without losing it?
I honestly feel that we have grappled with it, but it's not an impossible challenge. There are societies that do a decently better job of it, even in an industrial context. But I'll be honest, I think we suffer for having few good ways of solving this problem, right? I think, for example, deindustrialization in Northern England or the American Rust Belt would have been much milder had there been a desire to find people who wish to figure out how to do industry in the societal context that they found themselves in, rather than, say, people who perhaps came in from a more financial background to whom offshoring seemed as attractive as building domestically, right? Now, to be fair, either can turn a profit, but arguably you're running a very different organization depending on what your goal is. 1950s, the CEO of General Motors would say, what's good for General Motors is good for America, and what's good for America is good for General Motors. There are few companies today that can make that boast. And the interesting aspect of this as well to me is, let's look at Japan, right? In Japan, there's a practice called mukoyoshi, which is son-in-law adoption. This means that, whoever is the head of the family and the head of the industrial conglomerate sort of picks around for a talented business leader, someone who seems, ambitious, hungry, has good skills, has good values, and then they marry him off to their daughter. The person, when they marry the daughter, take on the old family name. So that's why it's called son-in-law adoption. Not only do you get a son-in-law, the son-in-law adopts your family name. And many companies that are household names today, at one point in their history, had this method of succession, like including Toyota, right? So this was a practice in 20th century Japanese corporations. You can probably see why this wouldn't work in most Western countries, right? People, usually don't get to choose or influence who their daughter marries if they have a daughter. The idea of, someone sort of changing their last name and then being, truly taken up into the father-in-law's business. Well, okay, maybe that can happen, but I don't see it happening that much. And when the rest of society looks on and looks at this, well, if it's a small family business, everyone approves. But if it was a company like Toyota, no one would approve. We would consider it, nepotistic or corrupt or something like this. We would assume that, this useless, son-in-law is being promoted just because of the daughter and it's private benefit. And this is such a big company with so many employees. Surely we can do something better. But the idea of choosing your romantic partner on the basis of that competence, that I feel is also different from our conception of marriage. And I don't think we should, or at least contemporary. I'm not saying we should adopt mukoyoshi, but I'm giving mukoyoshi as an example of a social technology in Japan, in an industrial society that alleviates the succession problem. Right. And we should consider what our equivalents might be. What would be our innovations that could work in such a way.
Thanks for checking out this podcast short. If you like this interview, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button and hit that bell so you always get notified about this podcast. And if you're really interested in conversations like this, you may want to consider joining the Articulate Ventures Network. To find out more, go to network.articulate.ventures.